No crowns, no writing, only stone tools and a question buried beneath the river's mud. We're following those vanished footfalls. The question, before kings and pyramids, did the people living along the Nile build a sustained, organized way of life that deserves the name civilization? Or were they roving bands, brilliant, adaptive, but ultimately mobile foragers whose achievements were etched only in stone? The oldest evidence is blunt and honest. Flakes, cores, and bifaces scattered across ancient river terraces. Lower Paleolithic hand-excavative balanced tools give way to the more refined livalloy flakes of the Middle Paleolithic, a prepared core technique that allowed knappers to strike predictable, sharp flakes. Later still appear microliths and backed bladelets, tiny slivers hafted into arrows or composite tools. Those transformations in stone technology mark changing behaviors, not just better tools. But technology alone doesn't make a society. The Nile-shaped lifeway, its annual pulse, the flood left pockets of fish and birds, reeds for mats, hippopaths that funneled game. Archaeologists read this economy in middens and hearths, charred fish bones stacked beside cut-marked limb bones, concentrations of shells on ancient banks, and discrete scatters of flint where people camped, butchered, and moved on. These sites show mobility tuned to seasons. People weren't tied to one house. They tracked food across a watery landscape, returning to favored terraces year after year. We contest mobility with modern science. Radiocarbon dating brackets late Pleistocene and early Holocene camps, while optically stimulated luminescence, OSL dates, buried sediments where tools lie. Isotope analysis of animal teeth oxygen and carbon ratios, river-fed diets, and seasonal water sources. When human bones survive, nitrogen isotopes hint at heavy reliance on fish and aquatic protein. Together these methods sketch a pattern, repeatable occupations at predictable places, not permanent villages but structured seasonal rounds. Social complexity appears in subtle forms. Some sites show spatial organization, work zones separated from sleeping patches, clusters of hearths suggesting groups returning together. The toolkit includes specialized implements for fishing, hideworking, and woodworking, suggesting division of labor and knowledge transmission across generations. Long-distance raw material transport flicks napped from non-local flint points to exchange or mobility over hundreds of kilometers. None of this looks like a palace. There are no monumental tombs, no temples, no administrative records. But it is dangerous to equate complexity solely with stone and stone stacks. These foragers maintained ecological knowledge, crafted technologies, coordinated seasonal movements, and kept networks across landscapes. They were the scaffolding on which later sedentary villages and, eventually, state formation would be built. Listen to the river now, a ruler of rhythms, not of kings. When rainfall patterns shifted and the Sahara and Nile began to change, those rhythms broke. What happens when mobility no longer suffices? That rupture will force new choices: settlement, cultivation, and the slow accretion of institutions that could become civilization. A wind scours the baked sand, then stops. Rain follows, not a single storm, but a slow inward push of monsoon moisture from thousands of kilometers away. The desert inhales. Pools appear. Reeds unfurl. Where there had been a corridor of dust, a network of marshes opens like spilled ink across the landscape. Between roughly 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, a sharp cold snap, the Younger Dryas, slammed the climate back toward arid conditions, throwing human groups across North Africa into familiar patterns of mobility. Then the world warmed again. The monsoon shifted northward during the early Holocene, and the region entered what climatologists call the African humid period. Lake and groundwater levels rose. The Nile swelled with more regular floods. Paleoclimate records, pollen trapped in lake sediment, oxygen isotopes in carbonate layers, and diatom assemblages from cores pulled from ancient basins, all tell the same story. Water returned, and with it, abundance. Archaeology reads that abundance like a map. Cut into the lake silts are hearths and concentrations of burned bone, layers of silt and crust grinding stones. Flint scatters change. Classic microlithic epipaleolithic points appear alongside new, heftier tools for processing plants and fish. At lakeside hollows and Nile backwaters, people began to stay put for longer stretches. They returned to the same shorelines year after year, scraping deposits into repeated floors. Post holes sometimes survive as darker stains in the ground. Hearths cluster as if people gathered around repeating rituals. not yet villages in the agricultural sense, but places with a persistence that mobility no longer erased. Nabta Playa, in what is now southwestern Egypt, becomes empty. When its playas filled, it hosted camps with stone mounds, burials, and by the mid-Holocene megalithic alignments, the landscape itself shapes the social, reliable lakes, concentrate, herds and people, producing denser gatherings and new forms of social life, feasts, shared hunts, and possibly early cattle cults, attested by faunal remains and ritual deposits. Along the Nile, sites on low terraces and island margins produced dense fishbone assemblages, harpoon fragments, and impressions of water plants, a river economy capable of supporting semi-sedentary life long before domesticated grains arrive. Scientific tools give the scene texture. Accelerator mass spectrometry, AMS radiocarbon anchors hearths to centuries. Stable isotope analysis of human and faunal bone teases out diets rich in aquatic protein. Sedimentology reconstructs flood cycles and shoreline migration. Combined, these lines show a transition driven by shifting hydrology. People did not immediately invent farming because they needed food. They paused, aggregated, and invested social energy where water made resources predictable. That investment leaves fingerprints beyond economy. Repeated occupation produces curated places, middens of shells and chipped stone, clustered graves with grave goods, and the first hints of communal labor in clearing, building, and perhaps in marking the sky with stones. These early sedentary sites are not the pharaonic cities of later millennia. They are not points, persistent places where ecological opportunity collides with human inventiveness, where mobility gives way to residency, and where social complexity begins to compound. The climate opened a door, people stepped through, and the Nile's new geography rearranged life into longer-lasting settlements. That rearrangement set the stage for later experiments in domestication, craft specialization, and the political packaging of power that will come into focus as human communities along the river grow ever more integrated. Wind scours an empty plain, but under your feet, the ground remembers water. Shallow basins hold cracked silhouettes of ancient lakes. Pollen and phytoliths trapped in those basins tell a sharp truth. This was once grassland, rivers braided. Papyrus thickets hummed with insects, and the monsoon reached far north. The Sahara, for millennia, bloomed green. At the heart of one vanished lakebed, people drove stones into the soil. At Nabta Playa, rings of granite and sandstone rise like frozen breath. Some stones sit upright, others lean, pointing toward horizons where stars climb. Charcoal from hearths under those stones yields dates through radiocarbon analysis. People moved here between roughly 9000 and 4500 BCE, with the biggest gatherings in the African humid period. Stable isotope studies of cattle bones, oxygen and carbon ratios show animals grazed on seasonal grasses, not desert scrub, and that herds followed water. Faunal analysis records an economy built around cattle and wild game, with fish and waterfowl when lakes swelled. Archaeologists uncover more than tools. Burials lay clustered near stone circles, adults wrapped with grave goods, infants tucked beneath stones, and in one striking case, a cow interred as if in a ritual. Bones show butchery marks and selective deposition. Clay and stone tokens, some carved with bovine motifs, suggest symbolic thought. People painted and polished stone bowls. Paths cut by thousands of barefoot steps radiate from campsites. These are not casual hunter-gatherer scatterings, they are planned places for return. The layout unnerves specialists. One alignment of megaliths lines up with the sunrise on the summer solstice. Another roughly points toward the rising of Sirius and the belt of Orion as it appeared 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Archaeoastronomers map sightlines and calculate precession, the slow wobble of Earth that shifts star positions, and find correlations that tempt explanation. Calendars to time migrations, markers to signal seasonal floods, communal rituals timed to the heavens. Yet caution sits beside excitement. Stone alignments can serve many masters: memory, territory, kinship, and yes, the sky. The evidence supports a mix of practical calendrical use and ceremonial display, rather than a single definitive observatory. Satellite imagery and geomorphology reveal Nabta as one node in a network. Scattered camps, buried waterways, and rock art link it to sites across the western desert and toward the Nile. Exchange of obsidian, shells, and pigments hints at long-distance contact. People here organized labor, hauling and erecting heavy stones, maintaining seasonal gatherings, coordinating animal management. Those actions require leadership, ritual authority, shared cosmologies. They create social fabric. Listen to the stones and the bones together. They speak of deliberate ritualization of cattle, a cosmology tied to stars, and communities that return to the same waterholes year after year. Nabta Playa does not hand us a pharaoh's palace, nor does it deliver royal inscriptions, but it does show people making sacred landscapes, marking time with stone and sky, and orchestrating life around herds and lakes. Those practices plant cultural stakes that will, centuries later, root in the Nile Valley's great riverine civilization. Dawn lifts off the reed beds of a shallow lake. Mist clings to the water like a veil. Men and women push reed boats through a lattice of channels. The oars slap, small ripples vanish. Here, where the Nile backed up into a basin, human lives reorganized around water. In the Fayoum oasis, people did not simply gather, they engineered. Seasonal floodwaters pooled in depressions, and villagers learned to trap and hold that water, cutting shallow canals, piling low banks, and carving basins in the soft lake bed. The technique acted like a natural irrigation system. The lake became a giant wetland garden. Archaeobotanical work flotation that lifts charred seeds from the dirt has recovered remains of emmer wheat and barley, lentils and flax. Pollen core from lake sediments record sudden increases in cereal pollen and declines in wild savanna plants. Radiocarbon dates place these changes in the mid-Holocene, roughly 5 to 004,000 BCE. That's when people shifted from seasonal foraging to planned cultivation. Bones tell a parallel story. Archaeologists sorting animal remains from Fayoum sites find sheep and goat bones in abundance. Cattle bones appear intermittently. The pattern suggests herding and penning, not simple hunting. Nitrogen and carbon isotope analysis of human bones, chemical fingerprints of diet show heavier reliance on terrestrial domesticates and freshwater fish than on wild grasses. In short, people were eating the products of managed plants and animals, and the wetland itself became a productive, predictable lifeway. Move north, into the delta, and a different experiment unfolds at Meremd Benis. From roughly 5000 to 4200 BCE, this low flat plain fills with rectilinear houses built of reed and mud. Excavations reveal streets, long storage pits, and concentrated middens. Deliberate settlement planning. Artifact assemblages brim with polished grinding stones. Sickle blades with gloss from cereal cutting, bone awls, and net sinkers. Pottery styles and shells from the Mediterranean show exchange networks reaching beyond the local marshes. People here farmed cereal plots, herded small stock, fished the channels, and wove reeds into rope and mats. The village grew, contracted, then restructured across centuries of evidence of social negotiation with an unpredictable environment. Both places show the same fundamental shifts: investment in place, investments in storage, and investments in plant and animal technologies. Wetland farming demanded a different toolkit: trays, sleeping platforms, grain storage pits to buffer against lean seasons, and boats to move goods. Isotope work and tool use where analyses revealed specialists, people who spent long days grinding grain, weaving mats, or tending animals. Seasonal mobility didn't vanish, but it narrowed. More people spent more of their lives tethered to a particular lake or village. Not everything is settled. The status of cattle-local domestication versus imported herds remains debated among specialists. Some bovine bones show butchery patterns and herd structure consistent with human management. Others look like hunted wild stock, but the larger pattern is clear. In the Fayoum and at Meremd, humans turned water into a resource to be stored and scheduled. They domesticated plants and animals into predictable calendars. They built houses that lasted decades. Those innovations, water management, storage, and settled craft, laid the bones of his civilization still forming, a pre-Pharaonic scaffolding of technologies and social rhythms that would shape the Nile for millennia. Sand peels off a small earthen mound. A glint of polished pottery catches the sun, a shard, red-brown and burnished smooth. Its rim blackened as if someone had held it in a dying fire. Archaeologists call that black-topped ware. The Badarians simply made it with practiced hands, coiling clay, scraping surfaces smooth, and firing vessels in open pits where embers and smoke kissed the lip into black. The effect is deliberate. It is technical control in a world still mostly stone. Radiocarbon places these people roughly between 4400 and 4000 BCE, not hunters, stumbling into permanence, but cooks, potters, and beadmakers who began to bend raw materials into durable forms. Their pots are thin-walled and well-fired, not accidental lumps. They bear finger marks and burnished strokes, fingerprints of individuals who repeated the same gestures day after day. That repetition hints at specialization, someone whose eyes and hands knew exactly how long to turn a wet coil on a paddle, who knew the precise mix of Nile silt and temper to prevent cracking in the fire. Cemeteries sit beside these villages like quiet museums. The dead lie in shallow pits, curled into a flexed position, wrapped, sometimes with ochre dust still clinging to bone. Grave goods cluster around them, cups and bowls, flint blades carefully arranged, polished mace heads, and strings of beads made from shells torn from the Red Sea and pebbles carried from desert veins. Those raw materials did not grow here. They moved, along seasonal river routes, overland tracks through wadis, by reed boat, beneath a relentless sun. Exchange networks now stitch the Nile Valley to far-off sources, long before kings claimed them. Burial practice itself becomes a performance. Pots are placed to face the body. Some skeletons show care, head supports carved from wood, subtle differences in goods and position. Not all graves are equal. A handful contain more elaborate pottery, more beads, finer tools. Those patterns suggest emerging social distinction. Status is not yet a palace or a throne, but it is visible in what people take with them when they leave the world of the living. Workshops leave their own archaeological fingerprints. Concentrations of flake debris indicate dedicated knappers, shaping sickle blades and knife edges. Tiny piles of shell fragments, ochre, and bead preforms mark places where artisans drilled and polished, creating ornaments that would cross desert and river. Stone polishing leaves swirls of grit. Bone awls and copper beads, rare but present, imply experimentation with new materials. Use-wear studies and refitting analyses show sequences of manufacture, cut, drill, polish, thread, hands specialized. Production scaled beyond the household. Science sharpens the picture. Petrographic analysis links certain clays to specific riverine deposits. Isotope and residue studies begin to read diets and stored foodstuffs from potsherds. When pottery interior surfaces hold molecular traces, fats, seeds, cooked residues, vessels become notebooks of daily life. Stews, cereals, preserved fish. Those notebooks show a mixed economy. Cultivated grains planted in seasonal floodplains, wild game and fish taken from lagoons, and livestock managed across the landscape. This is not yet the age of kings. It is the moment before kingship, when technologies and rituals accumulate into systems. Pottery becomes container and symbol. Burials become measures of difference. Craft specialization knits distant places into a material web. The Bedarian transformation is quiet, but it rewrites lifeways. People learn to make durable things, to mark their dead, and to trade signals of identity over hundreds of kilometers. In those small, repeated acts, the burnish of a pot, the drilling of a bead, the placing of a cup beside a shoulder, the raw clay of later states begins to form. Dust rises in a summer wind as hands press damp clay against a wooden paddle, shaping a bowl whose painted surfaces will carry the language of a rising society. Pottery becomes a voice. In Nakada Ika 4000 to 3500 BCE vessels are functional and fine burnished, black-topped, treated with rippling impressions and, then through Nakada to K 3500 to 3200 BCE, they erupt with scenes, boats striding like stitched shadows, ibexes rearing, birds locked in profile. The decoration stops being merely decorative. It is narrative, shorthand, a shared visual code. Kilns cluster near the Nile, workshops hum, stone carvers cut siltstone pallets for grinding cosmetics, then paint them with hunting scenes, and processions so detailed they look like frames from an enigmatic. One of these, the Gebel El Arak knife, bears a battle scene in a style that borrows from Mesopotamian motifs. Imported ideas ride on imported goods, lapis lazuli from afar, copper from Sinai and the Levant, shells from the Red Sea. Objects move along waterways and across deserts. Trade routes stitch the Nile to the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Hierarchy crystallizes in the ground. Graves expand. In some cemeteries, a handful of pits hold beveled knife blades, fish-shaped pallets, polished carnelian beads, and hammered copper luxuries, absent in the humbler burials nearby. These are not random accumulations. they are signatures of status, individuals whose wealth and ritual roles set them apart. By Nakada 3 ca. 3200 to 3000 BCE, tombs grow bigger and more elaborate. Workshops associated with elites produce prestige goods on demand. The archaeology reads like a ledger of power. Iconography sharpens into political language. Boats multiply on pottery and pallets, often led by masked or crowned figures. Standards, poles topped with emblems, appear in processional scenes. The falcon, weighty and poised, begins to hover over names and places. Clay tags and ivory tags from Abydos, large elite tombs bear incised symbols, Serek-like enclosures, repeated signs, numerical marks. These are not full sentences, but they are the first inkling of administration: labels for goods, names for people, shorthand for claims. Archaeologists call them proto-writing. They mark a shift from memory stored in objects to memory recorded in signs. Movement of people accompanies movement of goods. Strontium isotope analysis of tooth enamel, alongside traditional osteological work, reveals non-local individuals in elite burials, people who spent childhoods away from the sites where they were later interred. Mobility intensifies exchange of ideas, artisans, and marriage alliances. Settlements grow clustered at strategic points. Hierakonpolis and Abydos emerge as focal nodes, competing and cooperating, each cultivating craft specializations and ritual spaces that attract pilgrims, traders, and craftsmen. Violence and prestige entwine. Weapons appear not only as tools but as symbols: maces, copper knives, decorated palettes depicting hunts and combats. The line between warrior and ruler blurs. By the close of Nakada 3, the visual grammar of rulership, the falcon, the Serek, the triumphal procession has taken shape. It's a language ready to be spoken as state. The Nakada horizons are not a single moment. They are a crescendo. Pottery turns pictorial, burials turn stratified, signs turn symbolic, and regional networks lock into durable roots. Each painted bowl, each inscribed tag, each foreign bead is evidence that complex social choreography was already underway along the Nile. The choreography that would, within a few generations, step into kingship. A shaft opens to a dry, cool, dark. Hands long dead, stacked the walls with reed mats, pottery, and boxes of small things, beads threaded on ivory. A flint knife wrapped in linen, a carved hippopotamus tusk. Light from the archaeologist's torch skates across a bone comb, its teeth sharpened with a craftsman's patience. These are not random grave goods. They are the inventory of power. Elite tombs along the Nile, from Nakada to Abydos and Hierakonpolis, concentrate wealth and skill. In Tomb Uj at Abydos, hundreds of small clay tags and ceilings, once tied to jars, hint at managed stores and controlled production. An early bureaucracy in clay. A decorated knife from Gebel el Iraq carries a hunting scene in a style that borrows from Mesopotamia. Proof not of conquest, but of visual exchange and elite taste, tuned to foreign exoticism. Ostrich eggs, ivory, and imported shells glint alongside objects made from local stone and fired clay. The message was intentional. The dead had access to things others did not. Workshops cluster where the elites lived and died. Archaeologists dig floors pitted with hammerstones, rows of bead-making debris, and ovens glazed with the residue of experimental glazes, the precursors to Egyptian faience. Flint workshops leave patterns of flakes like ratlins around a mast. Bone carvers leave spiraled shavings. These production areas, often adjacent to elite cemeteries, suggest that craft specialization operated under elite patronage. Power here meant control of skilled labor and the capacity to transform raw material into symbols of status. Science unmasks the networks behind the gloss. Petrographic analysis pins pottery fabrics to clay sources hundreds of kilometers away. Lead and copper isotope studies trace metal objects to the Eastern Desert or Sinai. Strontium isotope ratios in tooth enamel can show that a child buried in Upper Egypt grew up near the Levant or Nubia. Each signal layers on the same story. These tombs are nodes in long-distance routes that ran along the Nile, across deserts, and by sea. Trade did not always move in straight lines. A shell from the Mediterranean and a bead of carnelian, material with a likely source in the Indus Valley or the Red Sea trade routes, can sit side by side in a single grave. Merchants, itinerant artisans, and reciprocal gift exchanges braided the Nile into a corridor of resources. Luxury objects served more than adornment. They stabilized alliances. broadcast status, and helped emerging leaders claim cosmic legitimacy. And then there is the choreography of burial itself. Tomb architecture becomes grander, goods more standardized, and symbolic objects palleted stones, boats carved in ivory. Early emblems of kingship appear more frequently in elite contexts. That standardization points toward institutional behavior, repeating rituals, centralized provisioning, and the material culture of an increasingly complex polity. At the edge of the shaft, the archaeologist lifts a bead the size of a grain of sand. Under the microscope it reveals 1,000 tiny steps, heat, pressure, skill, and in its chemistry the fingerprint of a landscape far upriver or across a desert. Those small things, packed into graves and workshops, map the anatomy of pre-Pharaonic power, not a single capital, but a network of elites who organized labor, controlled craft production, and stitched distant resources into the fabric of authority that would become ancient Egypt. A reed brush drips black onto a soft clay tag. The hand presses a tiny loop of cord into the clay, scratches a symbol, a bird, a ripple, a tall house, and leaves the mark to harden in the sun. That little tag will be tied to a jar, slipped into a tomb, or tied to a bundle of linen. It is a small, stubborn act, naming, accounting, claiming. Archaeologists pull these fragments from graves at Abydos and Hierakonpolis, shards of pottery incised with repeating signs, ivory labels, punched with sequences of marks, and the famous series of clay tags from Tomb Uj, dated by radiocarbon to around 3200 BCE. Those tags arrive in the present as scraped lines and repeating motifs that refuse to be mere decoration. Paleographers map the sequences, contexts speak. The marks cluster with goods, personnel, and place names. Administration hums beneath the images. On larger stone, the visuals sharpen into emblems of power. A falcon perches over a rectangular enclosure, a stylized palace facade. That composite, the seric, announces a ruler without spelling out a single sentence. The Nama palette and the scorpion macehead show rulers framed by symbols and captive scenes, kings bestriding galleries of enemies, standards bearing enigmatic emblems, processions of offerings. These are not idle pictures. They are performance, title, and threat, all compressed into a single image, language designed to be read by those who need to know who owns what and who rules whom. Archaeological science turns speculation into sequences. Stratigraphy pins the layers. Radiocarbon anchors dates. Paleographic comparison tracks the same signs, moving from potsherd to label to monumental relief. Ink analysis shows simple carbon pigments in the ink, while microscopic study reveals repeated tool marks, the same cutting implement, the same brushstroke. Petrographic sourcing of alabaster and diorite links objects to workshops hundreds of kilometers apart, proving that images traveled as goods and as messages. The critical shift was function. Counting became narrative. Tally marks on bone and flint transform into signs that don't just count cattle or jars, but identify them. Owner, destination, ritual use. The mark becomes a name. Over decades and centuries, pictographs that once stood for a thing, a house, a falcon, a mouth, begin to stand for the sound of the word, for that thing. Phonetic reading emerges. Visual shorthand grows a grammar, but not everything on a pottery rim is a word. Scholars still debate where symbol stops and script begins. Some marks remain administrative notations, mnemonic aids for traders and clerks. Others clearly operate as titulary, anchoring an individual to land, people, and divine sanction. The marriage of symbol and bureaucracy creates a new kind of power, authority that can be reproduced across distance through tokens, tags, and carved signs. Walk through a pre-dynastic cemetery, and you sense the pressure of that change. Standards and animals carved on mace heads, ivory tags threaded with cords, palette stones scored with sequences. Each object broadcasts belonging. Visual language knits together temples, workshops, and riverboats. It turns ephemeral speech into a permanent claim. In the cracks of clay and the grooves of stone you can see the first deliberate attempt to make rule legible, to fossilize power in image and sign, and in doing so to lay the graphic scaffold for a civilization yet to come. Reeds shudder as a hole slides from a papyrus bed, men hauling on ropes that bite through mud and light. The river takes the load grain, stone, exotic shells. A coffin wrapped in linen and carries it downstream to a string of workshops, shrines, and fortified compounds. Boats did more than move goods. They braided communities together. Clay vessels and cosmetic palettes from Nakada and Hierakonpolis show stylized boats carved in sweeping lines. Actual hull fragments and sonplank depictions date to the late 4th millennium BCE. The Nakada 2-3 horizon. Archaeologists have pulled reed bundle impressions, bitumen-coated redraft remains, and wooden planks from graves and riverbanks. The sonplank technique, thin timbers, lashed together with cord and corked with resin, appears repeatedly in iconography and early timber finds. Imagine craftsmen stitching wood-like fabric, then smearing it with bitumen so it rides the Nile without leaking. These were nimble, shallow draft vessels built to hug shoals, portage between cataracts, and thread channels that roads could not. Boats created economic space. They turned scattered workshops into a single marketplace. Heavy stone for megalithic tombs moved from quarries by barge. Copper ingots and beads arrived from stony deserts and foreign coasts. Here metallurgy and navigation intersected. Metallurgy in Pre-Pharaonic Egypt begins modestly called hammered native copper and simple beads, but by Nakada 3 smiths smelted and cast ores, producing alloyed copper with arsenic that hardened the metal. Archaeometallurgical techniques, metallography, trace element, fingerprinting, and lithocytive analysis dates those copper artifacts back to distinct ore fields in the eastern desert and Sinai. The chemistry of a blade betrays its birthplace. Obsidian blades, too, carry the volcanic signature of the Ethiopian highlands. Shells on elite collars came from the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The Nile was not an isolated artery, but a spine in an expanding circulatory system. These flows leave fingerprints on bodies and stones. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis of human teeth show movements. People raised upstream, buried downstream. Exotic raw materials clustered in elite burials, copper pins, lapis lazuli beads, polished ivory, evidence of long-distance exchange managed by emerging centers of power. Workshops specialized, beadmakers in one settlement, potters in another, smiths near ore routes. Boats ferried specialists and raw goods, while seasonal floods reset agricultural surpluses into tradable wealth. Networks did more than trade things. They transmitted techniques and symbols. Motifs on pottery migrate along river routes. Metallurgical recipes travel with itinerant smiths, and administrative tricks standardized weights. Seal impressions diffuse across sites. Bitumen-sealed cargo chests, rope coils, and sewn boats all carry the same practical logic, a set of technologies that make cooperation at scale possible. We can see the architecture of integration in the archaeology. Clustered cemeteries with imported prestige goods, riverfront workshops with slag and casting pits, portage trails where Bronze Age wheels never quite fit. Each technological innovation's sturdier hulls, hotter furnaces, embedded trade protocols, tightened links across the Nile's length. When metal glints in a grave and a painted boat sweeps across a pallet, they speak the same language. Riverine connectivity. Boats and metallurgy did not merely improve life, they engineered a network. That network moved wealth, people, ideas and, ultimately, powered on river, knitting disparate communities into the political and economic fabric that would become early Egypt. Dawn breaks over a braided Nile backwater. Men and women shoulder baskets of barley and fat cattle. A flotilla of reed boats slides downstream, and beyond the river a spread of mud brick buildings catches the light workshops, cemeteries, and the first ceremonial enclosures. You can almost hear the patient hammering of copper, the rasp of flint on flint, the low murmur of leaders marshalling labor. This is not chaos. It is coordination on a scale that transforms villages into something we can call civilization. Archaeology gives us the outline. At Abydos, El Kaibi, a cluster of oversized tombs, and the infamous cemetery Uj yield ivory tags, incised with repeated signs, the earliest hints of writing. Clay ceilings from Nakada and Hierakonpolis show repeated motifs stamped across storage jars and shipment bundles. Those repeated marks are not decoration, they are control. They mark ownership, consignments, and the beginnings of bureaucracy. Material concentration speaks loudly. Long-distance goods, copper from Sinai, lapis lazuli beads that arrived through a chain leading to Afghanistan. Shells from the Red Sea turn up in elite graves. Isotope analysis of tooth, enamel, and bone shows diets split along social lines. The powerful consumed different proteins and had different childhood landscapes than the subsistence majority. Radiocarbon dates bracket these changes to the Nakada sequence, especially Nakada 23C, 3500 to 3000 BCE, a period of rapid centralization. Iconography does the rest of the talking. On palettes and mace heads carved at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, a single figure orders defeated enemies, controls flocks, and dominates ritual scenes. The Nama paleted scenes of a man smiting a kneeling opponent, while standards in provinces gather reads like a visual claim to authority over the two lands. Around the same time, the falcon atop a rectangular sarric begins to appear, an emblem that will become the royal Horus name. These are not mere artistic tropes, they are emergent political language symbols, manufactured and circulated to legitimize power. Physical infrastructure confirms the narrative. Tel El Farka in the Nile Delta reveals planned streets, mud brick platforms, and fortified compound space organized for administration, storage, and defense. Large-scale craft areas, pottery kilns, copper smelting sites, and dedicated stoneworking loci indicate specialization and centralized control of production. Boats depicted in tombs and found as models testify to a Nile transport system capable of moving people, goods, and troops down river. Control of that artery becomes a mechanism of state formation. Conflict and competition sharpened this process. Battle scenes, fortified settlements, and increasingly elaborate tombs point to rival polities consolidating power through force and ceremony. Funerary architecture at Abydos and Hierakonpolis grows monumental, elongated tombs, processional ways, and carefully arranged grave goods that required organized labor and resources. Monumentality equals mobilization, and mobilization implies leadership capable of sustained coercion or persuasion or both. Taken together, these strands form compelling evidence, a network of power emerging from the banks of the Nile, using iconography, controlled circulation of goods, administrative marks, and monumental ritual to bind disparate communities. It's not a single moment of light and unification, but rather decades, perhaps a century of institutional build-up. By the time one hand levels opponents on the Nama palette, the institutions of a state are already in place, practiced, and lethal. The archaeology leaves little doubt. Before the first pharaohs were crowned, a pre-Pharaonic civilization had already learned how to govern, represent, and transform the Nile itself into a machine of rule.